Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the DevelopSec Newscast, where we're going to look at a few stories that we've seen out there in the wild that maybe we can take a little bit something away from and learn, so that way we can take that back and bring it to our personal and professional lives to help make us a little bit more secure. So the first story we want to talk about today has to do with Jenkins. Now, Jenkins is used to be able to build up your continuous integration, continuous delivery, that type of stuff in your development process. And a year or so ago, they actually released a patch to a flaw. Now, what's interesting about the flaw is it's a deserialization flaw, which we talked about back in episode 1 when we talked about the OWASP Top 10 2017 list, now including deserialization as one of the flaws. So, kind of timely that we see a deserialization flaw in the news coming about. So, with the deserialization flaw, it's possible to be able to execute remote commands. And in this case, the attackers are using this to be able to install crypto mining software to be able to go and do their work using your CPU cycles. And I think a lot of times we don't think about the fact that, okay, this is something that we use, right? It helps control our workflows, but it may not be that sensitive at first. But this helps highlight the fact that even though it may not seem sensitive, the fact that we can still use the CPU cycles, that we can use maybe some of those stronger systems that you have sitting out there for something else. Maybe I'm not after the sensitive data. In this case, we're not looking for sensitive data. In this case, they're looking for CPU cycles to be able to do crypto mining. So it's important for us to realize that our systems are always a target. Doesn't matter whether we have sensitive information or not, we're still a target for attackers to be looking at us. So again, I mentioned this was a deserialization flaw. And another important part about this is that this was patched in April 2017. So the fact that we're seeing now systems that are being compromised using this flaw is another indicator that some systems are not being properly maintained. They're not being updated as they should. From April 2017, this is definitely plenty of time to be able to send in your updates, right? Apply those patches to protect yourself. A lot of times we look at different types of software as the ones we want to protect, and then we overlook these ones that are just part of our ops processes. But these two also need to be protected just the same. Now, speaking of crypto mining, we also saw out there was a story talking about Tesla and their cloud computing environment also getting hacked, and again for the purpose of crypto mining. So they actually went out, and this was done through a Kubernetes issue where the Tesla application has not added authentication to their Kubernetes admin console. So anybody that has access to be able to get to the console can log in without supplying a username and password. This is always a concern for any application, right? We want to make sure that we have protection mechanisms so that unauthorized users don't have access to our systems. So in this case, we're able to get access to Kubernetes, and then from Kubernetes, they're able to install crypto mining software, do stuff that they shouldn't be able to do. Now, in addition to that, getting access into Kubernetes also coughed up the credentials to their AWS S3 buckets. So this was also another issue because by doing that, there was also some leakage of, or potential leakage of, telemetry data, other potentially sensitive information that was being stored up in these S3 buckets. So that is also a concern, right? So this led to multiple issues. One being the fact that we could install software to use. In this case, fortunately, it was just crypto mining software, not necessarily malicious in a way it was going to try to steal data. They just want to use the CPU resources. And there's lots that go into that to try to actually make it so it doesn't cause you a whole bunch of issues, so you don't find it. So the longer they can run it, the better it is for them. But at the same time, it also exposed credentials to other storage mechanisms, which then caused issues of actual potential leakage of sensitive data. So we got to be real careful about how we protect our systems and make sure that all of our systems have proper authentication on them so that not just anyone can go access those. Now, speaking of S3 buckets, there was a story talking about FedEx customer records being exposed. This wasn't actually initially FedEx. This was actually initially Bongo International, but FedEx acquired them back in 2016. And so they had a whole bunch of scanned documents, passports, a whole bunch of different information, driver's license, different security IDs, all stored on these S3 buckets. And then these S3 buckets were exposed so that they were publicly available. So anybody out there searching for S3 buckets, and if you pay attention to news stories, you see all the time, we're seeing stories about companies being exposed because they have S3 buckets that are exposed out there that have public access. So anybody actually willing to look, and if they know how to go out and search, they're able to find this information and be able to pull it up. Now, this information was from back in 2009 to 2012. About 100,000 documents, I believe, is what was exposed out there. So this is sensitive information. I mean, you're talking passports, you're talking driver's license. And, through acquisition, this can be difficult, right? Because you're taking a different company, you're bringing in their resources. Are you getting full access to everything they have? Do you know what's available out there? As an organization doing that acquisition, we need to make sure that we're doing that due diligence and trying to identify all the stuff that exists. On top of that, everybody that's using Amazon S3 needs to make sure that you're going out and checking the permissions on your S3 buckets. You're checking your ACLs on the objects in those S3 buckets to make sure that you don't have any public buckets sitting out there. And if you do have public buckets, making sure that the data that's in there is supposed to be public. Because a lot of times we try to rely on this idea that somebody won't be able to find that bucket. They won't know the name. They won't be able to get to it. But we see over and over, this is not true. So it's pretty simple to go in and quickly, at least at the minimum, log into your AWS console and check your S3 buckets. They show you the number of buckets you have, the number of buckets that are public. You can also go in and make sure that the ACLs and other permissions that you've set on those buckets are set up properly, so you're not giving developers certain access in, but doing that too broadly and making sure that, there's no public access if it doesn't need to be there. It's great that we're switching out to the cloud. We've got all these great resources to have. It's really easy to set these things up. I will say that Amazon S3, at least I went through and set up a bucket on there. And by default, it's very specific that it is private by default. So if you actually make a bucket public, it's because you've gone in and explicitly done so. And they actually create a big warning on the screen that says, hey, this is about to be public. Anybody can see this. So we have to go through and look at our processes and our policies to make sure that we're protecting these things just like we would any internal resource. So that wraps up this segment of the DevelopSec Newscast. If you've got questions or other stories that you think are interesting, feel free to send them our way. You can reach us at james@developsec.com or just find us on Twitter @developsec.